anything can become an addiction if we're using it to numb out and to distract us from the pain that we've experienced in our lives.
Welcome to Saints Sexuality, a podcast by FirstLight Ministries for educating the church about healing from sexual sin. Today on Saints Sexuality, we are continuing to get to know the men and women who make FirstLight possible. Joining us today is FirstLight's Clinical Director, Sharí Montague. Sharí, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Before FirstLight Ministries, you focused a lot of your energy on getting a theological education, probably even more than that on being a mom to your kids. At some point, you decided to pursue counseling. So what led you to pursue counseling as a career?
Well, I grew up on missionary stories. My mom would read missionary stories, and I had always wanted to be a missionary. And so the theological education came into that. And then I threw around different ideas about as an adult, like, oh, where do I want to do that? And what would that look like? And nothing felt right. I didn't feel called to anything. And then I went through a period in my own life where I really needed counseling. So I was already interested in psychology and theology in my undergrad. But I had a period of time when I was, particularly after the birth of my third child, where things got really hard. And so had gone to some counseling myself, and through that experience kind of saw the need for both, even more so. So I did counseling with my pastor, but I also did counseling with a therapist. And having the two voices was actually super helpful for me. So then we also hit a point in our lives together, my husband and I together, where we were sort of in a we don't know what we're doing right now kind of place. And so kind of all of these different pieces came together to say, well, here's an option. And so we made the cross-country move to come to St. Louis for a counseling degree for me. And then my husband also started in the counseling program, but then ended up getting a sociology degree, essentially.
So since joining FirstLight staff in 2019, you've had two roles. First, you came on as the Women's Ministries Director, and then you switched over to a Clinical Director. What fostered that change, and what led you to work at FirstLight in the first place?
Well, working at FirstLight kind of brought together multiple things that I had been thinking about or processing over my life. Really, it brought together the theological education that I had and the desire to do missions or ministry work. It brought together, and then bringing together the domestic abuse support group that my husband and I had been very slightly involved with at our home church, but both of us recognizing the need for both the men and the women in those situations to get care. That's one of the things I loved about FirstLight was that we're not about domestic violence, but there is a sense of like both the men and the women receiving care. So it brought that together, and then conversations about sexuality in the church that my husband and I had, just over the course of our marriage, and even before I was married, wondered sort of where those conversations were and why we weren't having them as a whole. I had pockets of those growing up with youth group and things like that, but particularly growing up in purity culture, I think there was a piece of that felt like we don't talk about it at all. And then now I'm married. Now what I do? What does this mean? So anyway, so kind of all those pieces coming together was I really loved that. And I loved that I was serving both betrayed spouses and women who were struggling with their own sexual stories. And so I got to care for both sides of that. When we decided to add the counseling arm of FirstLight, I really felt like it would be a good fit for me to move into that. I was thinking clinically already about what we were doing, rather than more pastorally. And so the clinical, and I had come to St. Louis to do counseling school. So that felt like a really natural fit for me to slide into to doing the counseling. So I really enjoy that. I'm really excited to be building that part of FirstLight.
Yeah, absolutely. So some people really criticize the legitimacy of Christian sexuality ministries, particularly for an accusation that they're built on pseudoscience. Now, I think some of them can be, but you're an LPC, licensed professional counselor. You recently became a CSAT, a certified sex addiction therapist by the International Institute for Trauma and Addiction Professionals. So your credentials and expertise really tell a different story, a clinical focus, as opposed to this kind of seems right. Let's try this out. So how does that clinical expertise inform your care for men and women impacted by sexual addiction?
Well, I mean, partially that's just my whole job is to care clinically for men and women struggling with the impact of sexual sin. I think as far as pseudoscience, that yes, in the clinical world, there's still conversation about whether we can use the language of sex addiction or not. I think I lean into people like Gabor Mate, who would say that anything can become an addiction if we're using it to numb out and to distract us from the pain that we've experienced in our lives. And so for that reason, I feel like if we're leaning into the experience that somebody has had of trauma. Most of the people that we care for, most people have some type of trauma in their past. That's just part of living in a world that we live in, and I would say a sinful world that we live in. So trauma is what we all deal with, and much of counseling is unpacking that so that you have the ability to move on with your life in a way that is healthy and is good and is right for you, I'll say. So from that sense of things, I think marrying the two, the biblical sense of our sexuality with strong clinical training, we can really help people to do that. And whether I want to call that, if somebody doesn't want to call that sex addiction, I don't care. We can call that unwanted sexual behaviors, and it's something that you don't want. But the point is to be helping people unpack what it is that is keeping them stuck and why they're coming to therapy in the first place, which is a therapist's job.
So your bio says that you are passionate about understanding God's design for sex and sexuality. As someone deeply passionate about theology and healthy sexuality, how is the church impacted when its members are living a healthy biblical sex ethic?
Wow, I think everything is impacted by that. I think one of the interesting things about sex, and I know what I just said there. Lots of things are interesting. I get that. But one of the things that's interesting is how actually integral it is to us as people. So especially adult people. Once we've hit puberty and once we've awakened our sexual selves, I guess you could say, or once that has been awakened, then we are sexual beings, and it impacts every part of our lives. Even if we want to say, well, this is done in private, this is not impacting anybody else, this is just my own life. The Bible talks about what's done in secret will be made known. And I think that even if what's happening is people feeling guilty and being held back, even if that's all we could say about what was happening in the church, I can't serve because I am struggling with pornography, or I can't do this. Think of the number of people that would be able to serve the church and serve the kingdom of God and not feel held back. So if that makes sense, if it's only their own internal sense of guilt that's holding them back, which I don't believe it is. But there are so many people caught in it. I mean, the statistics are astronomical when we look at number of people involved in pornography or sex outside of marriage in some way. And then when we when we look at the church, the numbers aren't any different. So the impact on the church, if the church were doing its mission without sexual sin to the extent that we have it, I can't imagine. I think it's like mind blowing to me what that might look like to have a church that isn't stuck. And it feels like the church as a whole, there's lots of churches doing lots of good things. So I don't mean that as a knock to the church, but I love my church. But I think, the kingdom of God thrives anyway, because it's his kingdom. But it would be incredible if this wasn't holding back so many people and not just getting stuck in it themselves, but just kind of, it feels like we're kind of walking through a mud field together, and we can't, like, it's just kind of holding us back. So thankfully God works with sinful people, and we are sinful people, and we will be sinful people even if it's not sex that we're dealing with or other things the church has dealt with. But that is kind of how I feel about, like, oh man, wouldn't that be incredible? And partially too, I just add, like, the men and women I care for are incredible people. We often use sexual sin as a, like, they shouldn't be involved in anything, or they shouldn't be doing anything. And there is place for somebody who's stuck in any sin to be removed from, whatever they're doing in the church, and to get care of themselves. And so I'm not saying that, but they are incredible. And if they're here in particular, if they're coming to FirstLight, like, they are godly men and women who are stuck in a sin that brings such guilt and shame that they can't see beyond it, and other people often can't see beyond it, that's part of why we're so careful about confidentiality and things. But we have incredible men and godly men and women who are receiving care, and I think that's just important to hear, and to remind myself of, even. Because we can sometimes, again, villainize sexual sin. And again, there are reasons for that, and sexual abuse is awful. And so I'm not saying, that there aren't severe consequences for those things, right? But the people that I'm caring for are not sexual abusers, or predators. They're godly men and women who are stuck in sexual sin, or the impact of sexual sin on their lives.
No. So kind of, you've already touched on this a little bit, but if you could dream big for what's on the other side of this ministry, what is possible through clinical care, not only for you, but for the church in general? Mm-hmm. Like, how would you hope that clinical therapy can coincide with the work of the church?
Yeah, especially in this area, I think it's necessary. I think it's super necessary. Like, I don't think the church can do this on its own. And I don't mean, God heals people ultimately. So I'm not saying that God isn't healing people. But I think the church at this time is ill-equipped to handle the trauma that's coming up, the pain, the hurt. And like, we're behind the curve as a church. Yeah. And I think we need to catch up. And I think a big piece of that is the clinical care. There are things that, unless you're specialized, even as a therapist, that you could do harm with by, saying something or doing something that would otherwise be a perfectly normal or acceptable way of caring for somebody. My dream would be that I wouldn't have a job anymore, frankly. I love my job, but I would hope that I wouldn't have to have a job. And I know, like, my prayer, my hope is that in heaven I won't have a job. I'll have a different job. But as it is now, my hope is that through clinical care, we can bring the real necessary work. To make it maybe a little more concrete, I feel like it's like taking a person to urgent care who needs to go to the ER and have surgery, right? So the church is equipped to do urgent care work, And they should. And then long-term care in lots of ways. But a surgery is a very specific, acute, you can't fix it by going to urgent care if you're having a heart attack or if your leg is cut off or something like that, right? You have to go to surgery. And so I feel like the clinical care provides the surgical, this is specifically what we're working on aspect that needs to be there. You have all the other pieces that have to come alongside that. It's not just surgery, but that's, I guess, how I would make a picture of that to make it more clear. Yeah.
On a different note.
Yeah.
We are at the end of our interview, so we get to do our lightning round questions.
Okay. This will be great.
Okay, this will be good. You're going to do great. So I've got 5 questions here.
Okay.
Each are designed expertly to give us a complete picture of who Sharí is.
Ooh.
So, coffee or tea?
Oh, that's a hard one. That's actually not an easy question. I drink coffee in the morning and I drink tea in the afternoon.
Okay. Both.
So both. Yeah.
Call or text?
Text.
What was the last book you picked up?
I don't remember. I think the last book I picked up was Internal Family Systems from the Inside Out.
Oh, is that all?
That's all.
Fair enough. Last question. What little thing in life gives you joy?
Peanut M&Ms.
On that bombshell of a revelation.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on the program, Sharí.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.